In December 2023, inside the Saltillo and Trenton engine plants, the final V8 blocks rolled down the assembly lines. The Hemi was dead. Chrysler's parent company did not shut down the line because the engine lacked buyers. They shut it down because the system around it had become impossible to maintain. Facing crushing federal emissions fines and corporate mandates to transition to electric power, the factories retooled for inline sixes and batteries. Dealerships lost their loudest draw. Mopar mechanics watched the defining block of the modern muscle era disappear into history. A decade earlier, that same badge had meant unrivaled American strength. The paradox is that the Hemi did not disappear because America stopped needing power. It disappeared because the rulebook changed and America needed power in a different form. But the real story of the Hemi is not only the story of a discontinued factory line, it is the story of how a specific combustion chamber became a standalone American myth, and how regulation, fuel, and time finally caught up to the elephant. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story of the Hemi begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in the engineering labs of Highland Park, Michigan in 1951. The story of the American Hemi does not begin on a drag strip. It begins with a fundamental physics problem in the engineering labs of Highland Park, Michigan in the years immediately following World War II. In the late 1940s, the American automotive industry was transitioning away from pre-war straight-eights and flathead engines. Automakers knew the future belonged to the overhead valve V8, but building a V8 was only half the equation. An internal combustion engine, at its core, is an air pump. The more air and fuel you can move through the cylinders, and the faster you can get the exhaust gases out, the more power the engine produces. The limitation of early American V8s was breathing. The valves were often crowded together in flat or wedge-shaped cylinder heads, forcing the air to navigate sharp corners and restricted passages. Chrysler's engineers had already solved this problem, but not for a car. During World War II, the company was contracted to develop an experimental fighter plane engine for the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The result was the Chrysler 2220, a massive inverted V-16 aircraft engine. To meet the military's demand for high horsepower at high altitudes, Chrysler utilized a hemispherical combustion chamber. A hemispherical combustion chamber, an engine design where the top of the cylinder is shaped like an inverted half-sphere, or dome, changed the geometry of power. Because the roof of the chamber was a dome, engineers could install massive intake and exhaust valves directly across from each other. Instead of forcing air to make sharp turns, the cross-flow design allowed the fuel-air mixture to sweep cleanly into the cylinder and the exhaust to flow directly out. Furthermore, placing the spark plug at the dead center of the dome created a perfectly even, highly efficient fuel burn. When the war ended, the V-16 aircraft project was canceled before seeing combat. But Chrysler's engineering department, heavily populated by pure research engineers rather than cost-cutting accountants, decided to bring that aircraft architecture down to the American highway. In 1951, Chrysler introduced the Firepower V8. It was a 331 cubic inch iron block that brought the hemispherical combustion chamber to the civilian market. In 1951, while Ford's venerable flathead V8 was producing around 100 horsepower and Cadillac's highly praised overhead valve 331 V8 was making 160 horsepower, the Chrysler Firepower debuted at a verified 180 horsepower. It was an immediate shock to the American market. When Chrysler dropped the 331 Firepower into the lighter Saratoga body, they inadvertently created an early prototype of the muscle car. State police departments across the Midwest quickly adopted the Hemi-powered Chryslers for highway pursuit, realizing the engine could sustain high speeds across long stretches of blacktop without gasping for air or overheating. But the Firepower was not a simple machine. When an American mechanic in a small-town machine shop opened the hood of a 1951 Chrysler New Yorker, they did not see the flat cast-iron surfaces they were used to. They saw massive, wide-valve covers that looked like they belonged on an industrial generator. Because the valves in a hemispherical head were placed on opposite sides of the chamber, they could not be operated by a single, simple rocker shaft. The firepower required a complex valve train with dual rocker shafts for each cylinder head, an intricate web of push rods, and a heavy cast iron block to support the mechanical stress. To perform a standard valve adjustment or rebuild, a mechanic had to navigate a landscape of iron that felt closer to a commercial diesel than a passenger car. It required specialized knowledge, more labor hours, and a deep respect for the sheer mass of the valve train. This created the first great tension in the Hemi's history, the conflict between mechanical superiority and manufacturing cost. Force 1, iron, aluminum, fuel, and manufacturing costs, was already working against the engine. The castings were incredibly complex. The machining required tight tolerances. The engine was physically massive and notoriously heavy. Worse, Chrysler's corporate structure at the time allowed its divisions to operate almost independently. Instead of building one universal Hemi V8, Chrysler, Dodge, and DeSoto each designed and cast their own unique versions of the engine. Dodge introduced the 241 cubic inch Red Ram Hemi in 1953. DeSoto launched the 276 cubic inch Fire Dome Hemi. None of the major internal parts, crankshafts, blocks, or cylinder heads, were interchangeable between the brands. For a corporation trying to compete with the sheer manufacturing scale of General Motors, building three entirely different, highly complex V8 architectures at the same time was an economic trap. Yet while the corporate accountants worried about casting costs and assembly lines, a completely different segment of American society realized what Highland Park had inadvertently created. The early 1950s saw the birth of the organized American drag racing circuit. Hot rodders racing on abandoned military airstrips in Southern California and the Midwest were constantly searching for a mechanical advantage. They quickly discovered that the Chrysler firepower's massive valves and cross-flow breathing meant the engine had almost limitless volumetric efficiency. If you bolted on multiple carburetors or later early mechanical fuel injection, the engine would just keep breathing. If you poured nitromethane into the fuel tank, the Hemi wouldn't blow apart. Its heavy, overbuilt iron block absorbed the violent cylinder pressures that would shatter a lesser V8. Pioneers like Don Garlits began dropping early Chrysler Hemis into custom-welded dragsters. The engine was heavy, but the horsepower-to-weight ratio could be manipulated through the sheer volume of air and fuel it could consume. By the late 1950s, the early Hemi was earning a reputation on the drag strips that completely transcended its origins in luxury Chrysler sedans. However, the corporate reality could not be ignored. By 1958, the cost of manufacturing the first-generation Hemi became unsustainable. Chrysler phased the engine out across all its divisions, replacing it with cheaper, lighter, and easier-to-machine wedge-head V8s. The first Hemi era was over. The foundries stopped casting the massive cylinder heads. For a few years, it seemed the hemispherical combustion chamber would become just a brief, over-engineered footnote in Detroit's history, an aircraft idea that was simply too expensive for the American highway. The architecture was proven, but the legend required something larger, an engine so massive it would need a nickname, a racing band, and an entirely new generation of drag racers to tame it. By 1963, Chrysler was losing the horsepower war. On the American drag strips and the high-banked ovals of NASCAR, Ford's massive big blocks and Pontiac's Super Duty V8s were walking away from Dodge and Plymouth. The wedge-head engines Chrysler had designed to replace the original firepower were reliable, and they were easier to manufacture, but they had reached their physical limit. They simply could not flow enough air to compete. To win, Chrysler engineers knew they had to resurrect the dome. A rogue group of Chrysler engineers, known on the weekends as the Ram Chargers, convinced corporate management to fund a dedicated racing engine. They took the heavy, reinforced cast iron block of their existing RB Series wedge engine and bolted on massive, newly designed hemispherical cylinder heads. They increased the displacement, the total volume swept by the pistons inside the cylinders, to exactly 426 cubic inches. In the American engine world, that number would soon become a physical measurement of terror. The 426 race Hemi, completed in 1964, was not designed for the highway. It was an engine built for one specific purpose: sustained, wide-open throttle. It featured a forged steel crankshaft cross-bolted main-bearing caps to keep the block from vibrating apart at extreme RPMs, and a compression ratio, the squeezing of the air-fuel mixture inside the cylinder before combustion, of 12.5 to 1. It required high-octane racing fuel, and it generated so much heat and pressure that it felt less like an automotive engine and more like a controlled industrial explosion. In February 1964, Chrysler unleashed the 426 race Hemi at the Daytona 500. The result was not a victory, it was a mechanical massacre. Richard Petty, driving a Hemi-powered Plymouth Belvedere, lapped the entire field and won the race. Hemi-powered cars took first, second, third, and fourth place. Ford and General Motors were completely paralyzed. On the drag strips across the Midwest and Southern California, the 426 Hemi began setting quarter-mile records that defied the physics of a heavy steel car. The engine was so massive, so physically wide, that mechanics started calling it the elephant. But that dominance triggered the system to push back. In late 1964, NASCAR President Bill France looked at the Hemi and issued a ruling that would accidentally change American automotive history. He banned the 426 Hemi for the 1965 season. NASCAR's rulebook stated that engines had to be production-based. You could not run a pure, experimental race engine against stock vehicles. If Chrysler wanted to race the elephant, they had to sell it to the American public. They had to put it in production cars, sell it through standard dealerships, and offer a factory warranty. Chrysler faced a massive industrial decision: abandon their multi-million-dollar racing investment or unleash a 426 cubic inch race engine onto the American highway. They chose the highway. In 1966, Chrysler introduced the Street Hemi. This was the breakthrough that turned a piece of mechanical engineering into an American myth. When a buyer walked into a Dodge or Plymouth dealership in 1966, they were not just buying a car. They were buying access to a restricted technology. Checking the option box for the 426 Hemi added around $900 to the price of a car that only cost about $3,000 to begin with. It was an astronomical premium, nearly a third of the vehicle's total cost. To make the engine barely street legal, engineers dropped the compression ratio to 10.25 used slightly milder camshafts, the internal shafts that control valve opening and closing, and bolted on heavy cast iron exhaust manifolds instead of tubular racing headers. But they did not tame it. The Street Hemi still featured two massive Carter 4-barrel carburetors, devices that mix fuel and air before it enters the engine. It was officially rated at 425 horsepower. Every mechanic in Detroit knew that number was a corporate lie, artificially lowered to keep insurance companies from immediately refusing to write policies. In reality, a well-tuned Street Hemi was producing closer to 500 horsepower right off the showroom floor. Owning one, however, was a brutal, uncompromising experience. The Street Hemi was not a machine for a casual driver. It featured solid lifters in the valve train, which meant the owner, or a highly skilled mechanic, had to frequently remove the massive valve covers and manually adjust the valve clearances with a feeler gauge. If you drove the car at low speeds in city traffic, the enormous carburetors would dump too much fuel into the cylinders, fouling the spark plugs. The engine idled rough. It ran hot. It smelled constantly of raw gasoline. The Street Hemi was an engine that actively punished you unless you were running it hard. But that was exactly why it mattered. In an era where American teenagers and mechanics measured their worth by what they could build in a garage and race on a Friday night, the Hemi became the ultimate trump card. It created an entire subculture of Mopar mechanics, specialists who understood how to tune the dual carburetors, set the ignition timing, and keep the elephant running. The badge on the fender became a psychological weapon. When a Plymouth Belvedere or a Dodge Coronet pulled up to a traffic light with the word Hemi on the hood, the race was usually over before the light turned green. It was an engine that commanded immediate, absolute respect, even from its rivals. Chrysler had successfully bridged the gap between the speedway and the street. They had turned their engineering department into a myth-making factory. The foundries were casting the blocks, the dealers were handing over the keys, and the tire companies were selling replacements as fast as the Hemi could burn them down. Chrysler had brought a race engine to the street, and for a few brief years, America's highways and drag strips sounded exactly the way Detroit intended. By 1968, the 426 Hemi was no longer just an engine option on a dealership order form. It had become the undisputed king of the American performance industry. Chrysler's management had fully embraced a simple, brutal philosophy. The easiest way to sell cars on Monday was to win violently on Sunday. They began dropping the massive 426 cubic inch block into lighter, more aggressive platforms. The engine that had once been hidden inside heavy luxury sedans in the 1950s was now the pulsing heart of the Dodge Charger RT, the Plymouth Roadrunner, and the Dodge Super Bee. At local drag strips across the country, from Pomona, California to Englishtown, New Jersey, the Hemi became a mechanical terror. In the National Hot Rod Association, NHRA, superstock classes, a racing division where vehicles were required to maintain their factory sheet metal, but were allowed extensive internal engine modifications, Chrysler's dominance was absolute. Factory-backed drivers like Dick Landy and the legendary team of Sox and Martin did not just win races. They turned the Hemi into a traveling industrial circus. When a Hemi-powered Plymouth Barracuda rolled up to the starting line, the staging lanes stopped to watch. The sound of a high-compression Hemi idling through open exhaust headers was unmistakable, a chaotic mechanical hammering of solid lifters and extreme cylinder pressure that vibrated through the grandstands. In an America where an engine could decide whether a young driver commanded a Friday night drag strip, a local machine shop stayed in business, a brand earned respect at a Monday morning parts counter, or a factory worker felt pride in what they assembled, power was not an abstraction. It was iron, fuel, labor, heat, sound, repair, and trust. The Hemi fueled an entire secondary economy, the American speed shop. These independent local garages dedicated purely to selling high-performance parts became sanctuaries for the Chrysler V8. In these shops, mechanics learned the dark arts of keeping the elephant alive. They argued over the precise jetting needed for the massive dual Carter carburetors. They debated valve lash settings. They swapped out factory ignition systems for high-voltage aftermarket coils, chasing every last fraction of a second on the quarter mile. To own a Hemi was to enter a demanding mechanical brotherhood. The engine was notoriously cold-blooded. It took time to warm up, it fouled spark plugs if left idling in traffic, and it required a level of routine maintenance that would have frustrated the average commuter. But for the American enthusiast, that maintenance was not a burden, it was a ritual. Adjusting the valves on a Hemi on a Saturday morning was a physical communion with Detroit's most extreme engineering. By 1969, the street culture surrounding the Hemi had reached a fever pitch. A psychological moat had formed around the badge. Drivers of big block Fords and Chevrolet Supersports often avoided eye contact at traffic lights if they saw the word Hemi bolted to a hood scoop. It was an engine that did not just win races, it preemptively ended them through intimidation alone. But the Hemi was about to push the boundaries of American automotive sanity, reaching a level of aerodynamic and mechanical scale that would soon force the outside world to finally look under the hood. By 1969, the battle for American horsepower had moved from the quarter-mile drag strips to the massive, high-banked oval tracks of the South. Chrysler engineers realized that the 426 Hemi possessed so much brute force that the limiting factor was no longer the engine's output. It was the air resisting the vehicle. To give the elephant the canvas it needed to run at maximum velocity, Dodge introduced the 1969 Charger Daytona, followed closely by the 1970 Plymouth Superbird. These were not traditional stock cars. They were aerodynamic missiles featuring massive sloping nose cones and rear wings nearly 2 feet high. But beneath that radical sheet metal, the heart of the operation was the 426 race Hemi. Running a V8 at wide-open throttle on a drag strip for 10 seconds requires massive, instantaneous power. Running that same engine at wide-open throttle for 500 miles around the high banks of Talladega or Daytona requires a level of mechanical endurance that bordered on the impossible. The Hemi's forged steel internals and heavy, cross-bolted cast-iron block absorbed violent harmonic vibrations that would have shattered the bottom end of a lighter engine. The hemispherical heads flowed air so efficiently that at top speed, the dual Carter carburetors were consuming fuel at an astronomical rate, essentially force-feeding the cylinders to keep the engine from leaning out and melting the pistons. This engineering climaxed on March 24, 1970. On the closed track at Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama, driver Buddy Baker piloted a Hemi-powered Dodge Charger Daytona test car, known as the Blue Car, to an official, verified speed of 447 miles per hour. It was the first time a stock car had broken the 200 mph barrier on a closed circuit. For the American automotive industry, it was a moon landing. The Hemi had proven it was the most capable high-speed V8 ever produced in Detroit. Because of NASCAR homologation rules, the requirement that racing vehicles must be sold to the general public in specific numbers, Chrysler was forced to build street-legal versions of these winged warriors. Normal American citizens, if they had the money, could walk into a Dodge or Plymouth dealership and purchase a vehicle capable of reaching speeds that previously belonged exclusively to aircraft and prototype race cars. The 426th Street Hemi was now powering cars that looked like they had rolled off a futuristic movie set, parked outside Midwestern grocery stores and suburban drive-ins. By the end of 1970, the Hemi badge represented the absolute peak of American mechanical arrogance. The engine had conquered every domain it entered. It dominated the NHRA drag strips, it held the top speed records in NASCAR, and it commanded total respect on the street. The sound of a Hemi firing up in a garage on a Saturday morning was the sound of a Detroit that believed the party would never end. It was an era when an engine's value was measured solely by its displacement and its elapsed time on a time slip, completely divorced from the concepts of fuel efficiency, emissions controls, or operating costs. The factory workers at the Trenton engine plant in Michigan were assembling mechanical royalty, casting blocks and bolting on cylinder heads that they knew would become legends before they even left the loading dock. But a machine that operates at the extreme edge of physics also operates at the extreme edge of society. The Hemi was loud, thirsty, and violent. It was an engine designed for a world with cheap, high-octane leaded gasoline, open roads, and an insurance industry that had not yet figured out how to categorize a 425-horsepower streetcar. The very attributes that made the 426 Hemi an American myth, its massive breathing capacity, its heavy iron construction, and its uncompromising racing DNA, were exactly what made it entirely incompatible with the reality that was about to hit Detroit. The elephant had conquered the quarter mile and the high banks, but the engine that could outrun anything on the track could not outrun the federal rulebook. The collapse of the first Hemi empire did not begin with a factory shutdown. It began with a piece of paper on a dealership desk in 1970. Before the federal government stepped in, the American insurance industry woke up to the reality of what Detroit was selling. Actuaries looked at the accident reports and the repair costs associated with 425 horsepower vehicles being driven by 20-year-olds on public roads. The insurers reacted by drastically raising premiums, specifically targeting big block and multi-carburetor engines. A buyer walking into a Dodge dealership could still scrape together the monthly payment for a Hemi Challenger, but the insurance premium often cost more than the car itself. That was the first small crack. The engine was perfectly fine, but the financial system required to keep it on the road had become hostile. Then the federal rulebook changed. In 1970, the United States Congress passed the Clean Air Act, and the Environmental Protection Agency was established. The era of unregulated American horsepower was over. Force 3, regulation, emissions, fuel economy, and certification had arrived at Chrysler's door. The government mandated drastic reductions in tailpipe emissions and signaled the phase-out of leaded gasoline. Leaded gasoline, fuel treated with tetraethyl, led to boost its octane rating and prevent premature, damaging detonation inside the cylinders, was the lifeblood of the 426 Hemi. The elephant required high-octane fuel to support its massive 10.25.1 compression ratio. Without lead, the fuel would ignite too early under pressure, causing engine knock that could physically shatter the cast-iron pistons. To make the Hemi survive the new unleaded fuel requirements, Chrysler engineers would have had to lower the compression ratio significantly. They would have had to restrict the massive Carter carburetors and strangle the exhaust flow. But a low-compression, restricted Hemi would lose the very mechanical advantage that justified its massive size and heavy weight. The engineering trap had closed. The cross-flow breathing that made it dominant on the drag strip made it incredibly difficult to tune for the new emission standards. It simply passed too much unburned fuel through the massive combustion chambers at low speeds. Chrysler's management looked at the cost of re-engineering the complex dual-rocker shaft engine to meet the new federal laws, and they looked at the dwindling sales numbers caused by skyrocketing insurance rates. The math no longer worked. In 1971, the Trenton engine plant stopped assembling the 426 Hemi. The death was quiet but absolute. In its final year, only a few hundred Hemi-powered cars were sold, including just 119 Hemi Cudas. The factories moved on to producing low-compression, smog-choked engines that could run on unleaded fuel. The assembly lines retooled. The specialized foundries that cast the massive dome cylinder heads shut off the furnaces. For the next 30 years, the American automotive industry entered the malaise era. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the vehicles sitting in Chrysler showrooms were powered by anemic four-cylinders or heavily restricted V8s like the 318 cubic inch LA block, struggling to produce even 140 horsepower. The physical landscape of American power shrank, but the Hemi did not disappear. It simply went underground. Because the engine was so overbuilt, the block survived. As gas prices spiked during the 1973 oil crisis, Force 4, fuel and energy shocks, many original Hemi cars became too expensive to drive. They ended up parked behind barns, traded away at rural used car lots, or stripped for parts in salvage yards. Yet in independent machine shops, at Saturday night drag strips, and in the garages of dedicated Mopar mechanics, the 426 Hemi became a mechanical religion. It became a working relic. Racers continued to buy, rebuild, and hoard the surviving engine blocks. The aftermarket parts industry stepped in to supply the gaskets, bearings, and valve train components that Chrysler no longer manufactured. On the professional drag racing circuit in the top fuel and funny car classes, heavily modified, aftermarket versions of the Hemi block became the only engine capable of surviving nitromethane fuel. The name Hemi detached from the Chrysler Corporation and became a standalone American myth. It represented a time before the catalytic converter, before the microchip, and before the fuel economy mandate. A time when the only limit to a machine's capability was the bravery of the driver and the strength of the iron. For 30 years, the Hemi was a ghost, surviving only in the hands of mechanics and racers, until Chrysler realized that the only way to save its modern future was to resurrect the name it had abandoned in the past. For 30 years, the Hemi was a ghost, living only in the toolboxes of drag racers and the memories of American mechanics. But in 2003, Chrysler's management realized they possessed a marketing asset more powerful than any new engineering acronym. To save their modern truck and performance lines, they resurrected the name. They introduced the 5.7-liter Gen 3 Hemi. Technically, the new engine did not have a perfect hemispherical combustion chamber. To meet modern emission standards, engineers had to flatten the dome slightly and add 2 spark plugs per cylinder to ensure a complete, clean fuel burn. But to the American public, the technicalities did not matter. The word Hemi was cast back into the aluminum valve covers. It was dropped into the Dodge Ram pickup truck, and soon after, it became the heart of the modern Dodge Charger, Challenger, and Chrysler 300. For the next 2 decades, it felt as though Detroit had cheated time. The modern Hemi became a staple of American highways. In the Midwestern farm towns and southern suburbs, a Ram truck with a 5.7 Hemi became the default tool for pulling a bass boat to the dock or hauling a trailer to a construction site. Then Chrysler pushed the boundary exactly as they had in 1964. They introduced the Hellcat, a 6.2-liter Hemi V8 equipped with a supercharger. A supercharger is a mechanically driven air compressor that forces massive amounts of air into the engine, creating explosive power. Suddenly, American buyers could walk into a standard dealership, sign a financing agreement, and drive away in a 707 horsepower and eventually a 1,200 horsepower street-legal vehicle with a factory warranty. At local drag strips and stoplights, the Hemi was once again the absolute king of displacement. But the Second Empire was built on a fault line. The exact same forces that killed the 426 Elephant in 1971 were waiting for the Gen 3 Hemi in the 2020s. This time, the trap was set by a combination of Force 3, regulation, emissions, fuel economy, and certification. And Force 5, electrification, hybrids, batteries, and convenience displacement. The federal government's corporate average fuel economy, CAFE standards, rules requiring an automaker's entire fleet of vehicles to meet specific miles per gallon averages, tightened drastically. Chrysler's modern parent company, a global conglomerate named Stellantis, was selling hundreds of thousands of heavy V8-powered trucks and muscle cars. The sheer volume of fuel consumed by these engines dragged the company's average fuel economy down, resulting in staggering federal penalties. By the early 2020s, Stellantis was paying hundreds of millions of dollars in emissions fines, often forced to buy carbon credits from rival automakers just to keep the Hemi on the dealership lot. The cost of the iron could no longer justify the cost of the fines. At the same time, the global automotive industry was mandated to transition toward battery power. An electric vehicle could provide the massive, instantaneous torque that the Hemi was famous for, without burning a single drop of gasoline. The corporate math was brutal and absolute. To survive the new regulatory landscape, the company announced it would replace the massive V8 with smaller, twin-turbocharged inline-six engines and heavy battery electric platforms. The first major crack appeared when Dodge announced that the Charger and Challenger platforms would end production in their current V8 forms. Dealerships that had spent 20 years selling American muscle based purely on the deep, rattling sound of a Hemi exhaust suddenly had to prepare for a silent showroom. Mechanics who had spent their careers diagnosing pushrod V8s were told they needed high-voltage electrical certification. In late 2023, the inevitable happened. At the Brampton Assembly Plant in Ontario, where the muscle cars were built, and the Saltillo engine plant in Mexico, where the massive truck blocks were machined, the final V8s moved down the line. There was no lack of demand from the American consumer. People were still willing to pay heavy markups for the last call editions. But the system could no longer support the machine. The engine still ran. The fines piled up. The rulebook changed. The assembly line stopped. The batteries moved in. The exhaust went quiet. The badge remained. The world it powered was gone. But the factories shutting off the tooling does not mean the story is over, because an engine built on mythology does not vanish cleanly into the scrap heap. The modern Hemi badge may have been retired from the dealership lots, replaced by the Hurricane twin-turbocharged inline-six and the silent thrust of 800-volt battery architectures, but the engine itself did not truly die. It simply transitioned into its final form. Force 8, industrial afterlife, junkyards, museums, and working relics, ensured that the hemispherical combustion chamber would outlive the factory lines that cast it. Today, the Hemi exists in a strange dual reality. It is a dead production engine, yet it remains the most vital aftermarket power plant in America. Through Chrysler's own Mopar Direct Connection catalog, a builder can still order a brand new standalone Hemi crate engine, an engine shipped in a wooden box directly to a garage or a machine shop. They range from standard 5.7-liter blocks to the monstrous Hellcat, an aluminum block, supercharged 426 cubic inch Hemi, producing over 1,000 horsepower. The corporate entity no longer wants the emissions liability on its daily highways, but it is perfectly happy to sell the raw iron to anyone willing to build a vehicle themselves. Out in the American enthusiast community, the original 1960s 426 Hemi has transcended the status of a mere car part. At the massive Chrysler Nationals in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, or at local swap meets across the Midwest, an original 426 Hemi block is treated like a mechanical holy relic. Restorers will pay tens of thousands of dollars just for a pair of original, date-coded hemispherical cylinder heads or a genuine dual-quad aluminum intake manifold. Specialized machine shops stay open purely to rebuild, sleeve, and balance these massive iron blocks, passing down the dark arts of valve, lash adjustment, and carburetor tuning to a younger generation of mechanics. This intense preservation is not merely nostalgia. Nostalgia is a passive emotion. Keeping a 426 Hemi alive is an active, physical argument against the direction of the modern world. A heavy cast-iron Hemi sitting between the fenders of a 1968 Dodge Charger is a physical record of a time when American power was completely legible. Today, when a modern electric vehicle or a heavily computerized hybrid system fails, the owner is locked out. The machine must be plugged into a diagnostic server. The power is controlled by software, encrypted modules, and sealed battery packs. But the elephant is entirely mechanical. Its power was not granted by an over-the-air update. It was generated by air, fuel, spark, and the violent compression of physical pistons. It required a mechanic who understood how to read a spark plug, how to set the timing with a strobe light, and how to feel the vibration of a solid lifter valve train. Preserving a Hemi is about preserving a time when Americans owned the power they used. The factories that birthed this mythology have largely moved on. The Trenton engine plant, which once poured the iron and machined the blocks that terrorized the drag strips, is undergoing massive retooling. Stellantis is investing hundreds of millions of dollars to transform these historic Michigan plants to support electric drive modules and flexible architectures. The heavy echoing foundries that once smelled of casting sand and hot iron are being replaced by the sterile, quiet assembly of copper windings and circuit boards. The industrial footprint remains, but the identity of the labor has fundamentally shifted. Yet there is a surprise footnote to the Hemi's survival, a place where the original 1964 architecture has never been replaced and likely never will be. If you go to an NHRA Top Fuel drag racing event today, you will witness vehicles that produce over 11,000 horsepower, covering the track in less than 4 seconds. These are the fastest accelerating machines on the planet, and every single one of them is powered by an engine based directly on the 1964 Chrysler 426 Hemi. The NHRA rulebook mandated that the sport remain grounded in that specific architecture. While modern top fuel blocks are custom machined from solid billets of aluminum, they still retain the exact bore spacing, the exact camshaft location, and the massive hemispherical combustion chambers that Chrysler engineers drew up during the Kennedy administration. The original engine design literally became the legal definition of maximum American power. Ultimately, the fall of the Hemi as a production engine was not a failure of engineering. It was a failure of compatibility. The world changed the rules. America demanded that its machines become cleaner, quieter, safer, and infinitely more efficient. The Hemi was none of those things. It was loud, heavy, demanding, and utterly uncompromising. We gained cleaner air, better fuel economy, and instant, silent electric torque. But we lost the physical sensation of an engine that had to be mastered. We lost a machine that announced its presence from 3 blocks away. We lost a piece of Detroit iron that didn't just move a car, but actively commanded respect. Somewhere in an American garage, an old 426 cast iron block still sits on a heavy steel engine stand, surrounded by oil-stained service manuals and spark plug wires, waiting for a Saturday morning to remind the neighborhood exactly what mechanical thunder used to sound like. See you in the next one.